President of the United States, Donald Trump, straight up cursed Vladimir Putin, the leader of the biggest nuclear power.
He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be...
Trump let loose on the Russian guy and said that, in practice, Putin has been more of a pain than a help in peace talks. And as if that wasn't enough, Trump even cursed Putin directly. With that level of attack, the big question hanging in the air is, could this completely ruin any chance of a ceasefire in Eastern Europe? Could this reignite an even bigger conflict? And after all, what exactly did Trump curse Putin about? In January 2025, Trump took office promising to be the peacemaker between Russia and Ukraine. He guaranteed that his personal relationship with Putin would be the key to solving a conflict that's been going on for over 3 years. But by May 2025, after multiple phone calls that sometimes lasted over 2 hours, reality started showing its harsh side. The crucial point that few are noticing is that Trump not only failed to get an immediate ceasefire, but also found out that Putin has a way more calculated strategy than he thought. During these talks, Putin made it clear he was willing to negotiate, but only directly with Ukraine, trying to push the United States out of the mediator role. That's a classic diplomatic move. Weaken the mediator to gain more control over the negotiations. Also, Trump proposed a full 30-day ceasefire in May, an idea Ukraine fully supported. But Putin flat out refused. It wasn't a "let's talk about it" or "we need more time to consider." It was a straight-up no. That forced Trump to publicly admit that the talks wouldn't lead to an immediate solution, marking the first major diplomatic failure of his new term. During the presidential campaign, Trump always talked about his excellent relationship with Putin, suggesting that this closeness would be enough to solve the Ukraine conflict. Early in his term, there were hopeful signs. In March 2025, Trump and Putin had a call where, according to an official statement, both agreed that the future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has huge potential, including massive economic deals and geopolitical stability once peace is achieved. But that diplomatic honeymoon didn't last long. As the weeks went by, it became clear Putin wasn't willing to make any significant concessions. The Russian leader stuck to his position that any deal should address the root causes of the conflict, which basically means Ukraine would have to accept permanent territorial losses and structural changes to its government. Trump, who initially paused some arms shipments to Ukraine as a goodwill gesture, started showing signs of irritation. In June 2025, during a NATO summit, he said Putin was being tougher than expected and that it was possible the Russian leader might invade more territories beyond Ukraine. Trump said his call with Putin went very well and that Russia and Ukraine would start immediately negotiating a ceasefire, but that early statement turned out to be way too optimistic and premature. Trump and Putin talked for over 2 hours, a significant length for a presidential call. During that conversation, some crucial points came up that revealed the real complexity of the situation. Putin made it clear he saw the negotiations as a matter that should be settled directly between Russia and Ukraine, basically trying to sideline the U.S. as a mediator. Trump told reporters in the Oval Office that very, very big egos are involved, a statement that might sound casual, but actually reveals something fundamental about the dynamics in play. What Trump was really saying is that both Putin and Zelensky have positions so dug in that any concession would be seen as a personal defeat. Even more telling was when Ukraine aligned with Trump's May call for a full 30-day ceasefire, a proposal Putin rejected. That refusal wasn't just a diplomatic no. It was a flat-out rejection signaling Putin wasn't interested in temporary pauses, but in solutions that met his long-term goals. Trump admitted that the 75-minute call wouldn't bring an immediate end to the conflict in Ukraine, marking a key moment where campaign rhetoric had to give way to diplomatic reality. This public admission was a milestone because it represented the first official acknowledgement that Trump's initial strategy wasn't working. The failure of these talks sent shockwaves through the international diplomatic scene. European allies, who initially worried about Trump's conciliatory approach to Russia, now face an even more complicated situation. France and Germany, who had been trying to act as complementary mediators, lost key communication channels with Moscow. The European Union had to quickly recalibrate its strategy. With the U.S. showing that even top-level direct diplomacy could move Putin, Europeans started preparing for a longer conflict. That meant talks about increasing military spending, strengthening eastern defenses, and preparing for possible additional waves of refugees. Within NATO, the situation sparked internal debates on how to respond to a Russia that clearly wasn't negotiating in good faith. Some members pushed for a tougher stance, while others still looked for alternative diplomatic paths. Russia's military response to the failed negotiations was immediate and intense. Right after Trump admitted his talks with Putin failed, Russia launched one of the biggest air attacks since the conflict began. Over 150 drones and multiple missiles were reported, mainly targeting Kyiv and other important Ukrainian cities. This escalation wasn't an accident. Military experts saw the attack as a clear message from Putin. If there's no diplomatic progress, the solution will be purely military. The record number of drones also showed Russia still has plenty of military capacity left, contradicting analyses suggesting Russian forces were weakening. On Ukraine's side, the response was just as firm. President Volodymyr Zelensky, who had participated in talks about possible territorial concessions, hardened his stance again. He declared Ukraine wouldn't accept any deal meaning permanent loss of territory or externally imposed constitutional changes. With direct diplomacy failing, Trump had to completely flip his approach, and that shift was more dramatic than most realize. Shortly after taking office, Trump had initially paused some arms shipments as a goodwill gesture, but that diplomatic honeymoon only lasted a few months. The turning point came when Trump was forced to admit Putin would only respond to pressure, not incentives. 2 weeks after taking office, on January 22, 2025, Trump threatened additional sanctions and high tariffs on Russia if Putin didn't make a deal to end the conflict. That was the first public sign Trump's initial strategy was falling apart. But the sanctions didn't stop there. The European Union approved its 17th sanctions package in May 2025, cutting Russian revenues by 13.7% compared to March 2023. The new sanctions included restrictions on Surgutneftegaz, one of Russia's biggest oil companies, cutting a major revenue source for Moscow. What makes this situation even more interesting is that the sanctions are working differently than expected. Although they've been effective at disrupting Russia's economy, evasion, and trade diversion through third countries limit their impact. Russia has found ways to get around many restrictions, especially through partners like China and India. Trump, who had harshly criticized the previous administration for providing too many weapons to Ukraine, now found himself forced to reconsider that exact strategy. In talks with Saudi officials in Jeddah, the U.S. promised to resume aid and intelligence support for Kyiv, marking a complete reversal of its initial position. The failure of Trump-Putin negotiations sent shockwaves way beyond Eastern Europe, and the effects are being felt across almost every aspect of global economics and politics. Global markets reacted immediately and dramatically to the prospect of a prolonged conflict. Oil prices shot up, but what few realize is that this doesn't just hit consumers at the gas pump. African countries reliant on energy imports face severe economic crises. Nations like Senegal and Ghana have seen their currencies drop drastically, forcing governments to cut investments in education and healthcare. In Asia, the situation is even more complicated. India, which has become one of the biggest buyers of discounted Russian oil, now faces growing pressure from the U.S. to reduce those purchases. This puts New Delhi in an impossible spot. In the Pacific region, China has been watching closely how the U.S. handles Putin. The perception that even Trump couldn't sway Putin through personal diplomacy sent worrying signals about the effectiveness of American diplomacy. Xi Jinping saw this as an opportunity to expand Chinese influence, especially in Africa and Latin America. China dramatically increased its investments in countries traditionally allied with the U.S., offering loans and infrastructure deals without the political strings America usually attaches. This is causing a fundamental shift in the global power balance. Facing all this, the European Union had to quickly adjust its security and energy strategies. Countries like Germany, heavily dependent on Russian gas, had to implement emergency measures. Energy costs for European families tripled in some countries, sparking social crises governments are struggling to control. France and Germany, acting as complementary mediators, lost crucial communication channels with Moscow. This forced Europe to consider a much greater militarization than anyone thought necessary in the 21st century. The conflict's escalation also brought worrying new tech dimensions. With negotiations failing, both sides ramped up cyber operations. Russia increased attacks on critical Ukrainian infrastructure, including power grids and communication systems. On the Western side, talks began about providing Ukraine with more advanced electronic interception and satellite intelligence systems. This marked a significant escalation in the conflict's technological level, turning it into a real showcase of modern military capabilities. Cybersecurity became a global concern. With the conflict intensifying, cyber attacks on civilian targets in countries supporting Ukraine increased, hitting banking systems and critical infrastructure. The reality is, with direct talks failing, the world faces several worrying possibilities. The first scenario is the continuation and intensification of the current conflict, with both sides preparing for a prolonged showdown. Putin made it clear he won't back down from his goals, while Ukraine, backed by the West, holds firm. The second scenario involves possible expansion of the conflict to other regions. Trump's comments about Putin possibly invading more territories weren't made in a vacuum. There are real concerns about Moldova, Georgia, and even provocations on the borders of Baltic countries. A third, maybe the scariest scenario, would be an escalation involving nuclear powers directly. Nobody wants to think about that, but the failure of traditional diplomacy raises risks of misunderstandings and accidental escalations. What many don't realize is we're witnessing a showdown between three very different personalities, each with their own motivations and psychological strategies. Trump came into office with absolute confidence in his ability to make deals. His approach was always based on the idea that any problem can be solved through direct negotiation between leaders. When he said there were very, very big egos involved, he was admitting something unexpected. Some situations just can't be fixed with personal charm alone. Trump's frustration became clear when he publicly admitted talks wouldn't bring immediate peace. For someone whose political identity was built around making deals, that admission was devastating. It explains why he shifted so fast from a conciliatory approach to threats of sanctions and tariffs. Putin, on the other hand, is playing a completely different game. He's not interested in quick solutions or temporary ceasefires. For Putin, the Ukraine conflict is part of a much bigger strategy to reposition Russia on the world stage. His refusal of the 30-day ceasefire proposed by Trump wasn't stubbornness. It was strategic calculation. Putin knows time is on his side in many ways. He's aware Western public opinion might tire of the conflict. Economic costs could force political changes in countries supporting Ukraine, and Russia has more capacity to sustain a long conflict than many think. Zelensky is stuck in an impossible spot. He has to balance American pressure for negotiations with the need to keep support from his own people. When he aligned with Trump's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, he was signaling willingness to negotiate, but also knew Putin would reject it. What makes Zelensky's situation even trickier is that he knows any major concession might be seen as betrayal by his people. Millions of Ukrainians have died or lost their homes. It's impossible to explain to them that some territories must be sacrificed for peace. Given all this, there's a crucial time factor affecting these dynamics. Trump knows he has a limited term and needs to show diplomatic results to his political base. Putin knows this and is using that time pressure to his advantage, basically waiting for Trump to get more desperate and willing to make concessions. International pressure is also creating interesting dynamics. European allies are pushing Trump to be tougher with Putin, while some developing countries are pushing for quick talks because they're suffering from the economic side effects of the conflict. The failure of Trump-Putin negotiations marks a crucial moment in contemporary history. It represents not just the end of a specific diplomatic strategy, but also the start of a new phase of global confrontation. With Putin showing he won't make major concessions and Trump forced to ditch his initial conciliatory approach, the world faces a scenario where the conflict might become even longer and more destructive. The question now isn't if there will be peace in Ukraine, but how the world will handle a conflict that looks like it's here to stay for much longer. The consequences of this reality reach far beyond Europe's borders, affecting global stability, the world economy, and the future of international relations. What do you think about this situation? Do you believe there's still room for diplomacy, or are we inevitably heading toward a bigger escalation? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this discussion is key to understanding the world we're building for future generations.